Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Meet the Beguiling Beluga, presented by Nat Hab Expedition Leader Eddy Savage. It's wonderful to have you with us today, Eddy. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Glad to be back for another Daily Dose of Nature. I love being able to dive into some of the critters that I've seen on expeditions with Nat Hab and give you a bit of an overview. Today, I'll be talking about the beluga whale, also known as the white whale, or the canary of the sea, because of their fantastic vocalization abilities. But really quite a curious and well-loved and appreciated whale around the world. So just to introduce myself, oh, hold on. How are we doing here? I'm trying to make sure that the slides are going, but it looks like it's not going. Is anything working there? Oh, there we go.
Yep, you're
okay.
Good.
Sweet, thanks, Kendall. So hey, my name's Eddy Savage. I've been guiding, or I've been an expedition leader with Natural Habitat Adventures since 2016. If you've been on one of my trips, hello again. Nice to make your internet acquaintance. Trips that I lead for Nat Hab these days, I do the Churchill polar bear trips, Churchill photo trips as well, the beluga whale or beluga whales and Arctic wildlife in the summer in Churchill, as well as the northern lights in the winter time up in Churchill. Many of the beluga whale photos that you're going to see in this presentation are from my trips up to Churchill, Manitoba, over the last 3-4 years. As well, this picture was taken with my friend Philip in China on the Wild Side of China expedition. It was a photo trip. I've been leading those since 2017 for Nat Hab. As well, I do the Switzerland trips, or the Wild Side of Switzerland, which is a summer trip over to meander through the Swiss Alps, which is great. But my background, it spans much more. I started guiding back in 2008, so that would make this year 13 or 14 years of guiding. Everything from kayak guiding with killer whales to doing whale watching excursions with power boats to doing grizzly bear viewing, photography, all that kind of stuff. As well, I lead trips in Antarctica, kayaking trips in Antarctica, and more recently I've started working on a fleet of 70 and 80 foot expedition sailboats that go into the Great Bear Rainforest and up to Alaska as well. But besides that, very happy to be here speaking to you about Natural Habitat Adventures and the beluga whale. So where to begin? Gosh, beluga whales they've got to be one of my favorite whales. They're definitely in the top 3. They're so curious and sociable in the wild as well, which really kind of always makes me take a step back. Their curiosity, their interest in things really says a lot in regards to their intelligence. So today, my presentation, I'm going to give you a description of beluga whales, so you kind of have a general idea. I'm going to tell you kind of where they're found around the world. I'm going to talk just shortly about a few different subpopulations that are not spoken about, but definitely or not spoken about too often, but definitely need some attention in this presentation. And then at the end, I'm going to go over kind of the conservation conversation about beluga whales and kind of where they stand today, where they've stood historically, and where they stand in the future. Yeah, and go from there. So I hope you enjoy. Let's get started. So beluga whale, what is a beluga whale? It is a white whale. It's a member of the, actually I've got another slide for that I'll talk about in just a moment. It's a white whale, typically between 12 and 20 feet long. Each subpopulation, so there's several different subpopulations around the world. Each subpopulation will have different size ranges. The Western Hudson Bay population that's around Churchill, for example, would be one of the smaller subpopulations. Typically, those whales only reach between 12 and 14 feet, weighing anywhere from 1,500 to 2,500 pounds. But in general, beluga whale size, you're looking at anywhere from 12 to 20 feet, 20 feet being a large male beluga whale, and weighing up to 3,500 pounds, or about a ton and a half, which is quite something for these whales. Something to note about them as well is their habitat is the Arctic, with an exception. So with an exception, which is the St. Lawrence population, which is down in the St. Lawrence Seaway, kind of heading out to the Atlantic Ocean from places like Quebec City and Montreal, kind of down the St. Lawrence River and into the estuary area there, and the Saguenay River in Quebec as well. So they're typically found in the Arctic, living nearby sea ice. They do require sea ice and all the animals that surround sea ice for their survival. That kind of explains maybe the color white. But yeah, that's kind of the critter that we're looking at, is that 12 to 20 foot, 1,500 to 3,500 pound Arctic whale, that it makes gigantic migrations, which we'll touch on in just a couple slides as well. So let's talk about some of the adaptations that the beluga whale has for where it lives. First off is, actually, I'll start with the color, which is the color white. That we've got ice up in the Arctic, and beluga whales do have predators. Natural predators, and I'll touch on this in a bit, may include orcas or orcas, humans, and potentially polar bears. But the color white, it's thought that these whales are white, and that helps them blend in with sea ice, which makes them not as easy to spot. It kind of makes sense within that habitat. But some other adaptations that they do have include the dorsal ridge. So most whales, humpback whales, orcas are kind of the opposite example, where they've got gigantic dorsal fins. Most whales have dorsal fins, but the beluga whale has a dorsal ridge. So the fin is completely gone. And the concept with that is that it probably kind of adapted away because of their relationship with ice, constantly moving and swimming around sea ice. In areas sometimes, like the typical ice coverage for the habitat of the beluga whale in the winter is between 40 and 80%. So they're always around, or almost always around, significant amount of ice in the winter. And so over time, a dorsal fin maybe became a bit of a hindrance for that movement. Also, living in colder temperatures, colder climates, with a surface area that you do, some of their extremities, like the dorsal fin or their pectoral fins that you can see there, or the tail, they've kind of become small and nubby, which may help with heat preservation or controlling heat loss when they are in water that is close to freezing. They do have a single blowhole, which is pretty typical of your toothed whales. They have blubber, so all around them there's like a 4-inch thick layer of blubber. That layer of blubber helps keep them insulated from those cold Arctic temperatures, which is very important. It's also something we'll talk about a bit down the line, is that it's a food source. And then up front, you can see that the beluga whales have that gigantic melon. That's one of the more defining characteristics of beluga whales, is that melon. It's actually something that beluga whales can somewhat control the shape of. It's basically just a big, kind of a big melon or melon-shaped clump of fat. And its purpose has to do with communication, which we'll get into in a bit. But that's definitely like a really defining characteristic of the beluga whale. And another one is the streamlined body. So I kind of touched on that with the small pectoral fins and small tail fluke, and lack of a dorsal fin. But essentially, they're very smooth and streamlined for life around ice and moving around in the Arctic. Another thing to note with that streamlined body is beluga whales. They're one of the few whales that actually have an elongated neck, and the neck vertebrae are not fused. So they have very good ability at turning their head and moving their necks around. It also kind of is one of the reasons why beluga whales in particular in captivity have been seen making strange faces or like double chins and stuff like that. It's essentially because they have a lot more movement with that head, which helps them in turn with their prey. But I'll get to kind of prey and what their diet is in a little bit. So they are one of two members of the Monodontidae. Essentially, the other member of that family is the narwhal. So beluga whales and narwhals, things that they have in common is they're both Arctic whales, Arctic species. There have been recorded hybrids of them, so they're closely enough related that they could breed and have a hybrid offspring. Whether or not that offspring is able to breed yet again and then have another hybridized offspring is uncertain. I don't think it's been documented, at least from my reading in the wild. Excuse me. And so that's kind of interesting. So some other things that are fairly similar about them, other than living in the Arctic, is their gestation period is about the same, 14 to 15 months. And they both kind of migrate throughout the season. So a somewhat large migration is important in their lifestyle as well. So those are just some similarities between the narwhal and the beluga whale. Their social structure comes down to a variety of things. So what we see here, I'm just guessing that because of how spaced out they are and the size of those whales in my picture here from Churchill, that this would be what's called a bachelor herd. So what's really cool about beluga whales is they don't, like other whales in particular, that the one that I can think of would be like an orca. They have very, very strict social structures, something called a matriline, where there's a matriarch, which is kind of the oldest female of that group, kind of the mother, and then her offspring, and then their offspring all follow her around. And that would be a matriline, and that's what kind of makes up an orca pod. Whereas the beluga whales, they're a lot more fluid. Something that I want to emphasize about them absolutely is that they're highly sociable. They often travel in groups of anywhere from 10 animals to 100 animals. Average pod size would kind of be in that 10 to 25 animal range. And the different groups are typically bachelor groups. So, adult males of breeding age. Maybe they'll have some younger ones with them that are not of breeding age yet, but they'll hang out together. They'll also have groups of mothers and calves, or kind of like nursery groups, where you've got mothers and calves and juveniles all kind of traveling together. That's more kind of for the safety and protection of those younger babies, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And then they'd have what are called kind of mixed groups, so just a variety of males and females and juveniles and calves and all kinds of stuff. So that's kind of like that super diverse social structure. And another thing too is they're not restricted to the same group. So you could have a group of mothers and calves. Let's say there's 10 mothers and calves that are hanging out, and then 50 miles away you've got another 10 mothers and calves in another estuary hanging out. And over the course of a week they intermingle, and then they could all switch spots completely. They have no kind of adherence to any travel partners that we know of. They're very flexible in where they go. Same with the bachelor herds. They can just kind of spread and break apart and form in different ways. It's not as strict as kind of the matriline, which is really cool. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the calving as well. So yeah, breeding and reproduction. This one is kind of tricky with the belugas because most of the information that we have about beluga whales breeding and reproduction comes from captivity. And observing that in captivity is one thing, but it's definitely hard to get a real idea of the process that may happen during the kind of the late winter, early spring months out close to the sea ice edge. So it's thought that the beluga whales breeding occurs kind of in the late winter, early spring, out at the ice flow edge. And if you're a researcher trying to kind of track beluga whales and their breeding habits during that time, and you're going into the Arctic to observe that, you run into the issue of incredibly challenging winter ice conditions, and these whales that move long distances, and also they're quite remote and far away from people. So there haven't been too many documented cases of, yes, this is what's going on with beluga whale breeding. There's ideas, and on top of that, just to make it more confusing, different population ranges are also, or different population groups, like say the whales in Russia and the whales in Hudson Bay, and then the whales over in Cook Inlet, Alaska, they're all going to have slightly different timings based on what's right for their environment. It's thought that it happens kind of that late winter, early spring, and then the gestation period, 14 to 15 months, ends up that the females that have been pregnant for that period of time give birth to calves in the estuaries or large estuary systems around the Arctic, basically kind of calmer, warmer areas to give birth. So I'll jump into that. Oh, actually, one more thing on breeding and reproduction. So typically females kind of reach the reproductive age between 4 and 7 years old, and then the males reach reproductive age kind of between the 7 and 10 years old. So there's kind of a bit of a staggered thing going on there. And then beluga whale females will give birth like once every 3 years, and they typically stop becoming reproductive after about 25 years old. So they could have quite a number of sets of young and then continue to live. They are one of a few animals on Earth, a few mammals on Earth that go through menopause. So humans are one, beluga whales are another one. And there's an interesting discussion about, why that might be. This also comes up with orcas. Orcas are another species that the females go through menopause once they've reached a certain age, and they can live to be over 100 years old, like orcas in the wild. And beluga whales, the age as well, it kind of varies between 40 and 80 years old for a long-lived beluga whale. And so, in a lot of populations, like like in a lot of wild animal populations, when a female no longer becomes kind of reproductive, she becomes kind of not an outcast, but pushed to the outside of that kind of that circle. She's no longer, or that animal is no longer viable within the population. And so with belugas and orcas, it's not that way. As they go through menopause, they are still there. And the concept is, because they are long-lived, long travelers, and they rely on a variety of different food sources, that there's lessons in navigation that is learnt by the older generations, that is then taught to the younger generation. So it's kind of like there's a need for those animals to stay within the population because of their expertise throughout the area, throughout their range and their habitat. A good example of that is with orcas, for example, around the southern resident killer whales that live kind of around the Puget Sound, Seattle area, as well as Vancouver, southern Vancouver Island. You can imagine that if there's a matriarch who is 100 years old, she was taught by her matriarch or her grandmother or great grandmother, 80 years ago, all of these different food hunting places, and especially now in this region where we're starting to see we have been seeing really large Chinook salmon declines. She knows where to go in a time of hardship and where to take her pod during a time of hardship or salmon stock failure because of the lessons that she's learned and everything she's learned over the course of that 100-year lifespan. So very interesting, and the same concept could be applied to beluga whales. So calving and raising of young. Actually, I just want to touch on something. So this beluga whale, it's a little bit gray, but even more so, you see this beluga whale is very gray in that picture. So when belugas are born, they kind of take on like a grayish brown or a grayish orange color to them, or orange tinge to them. And and it will take them until adulthood to lose the gray. So typically about 7 years is a good number to look at. But each year they'll come back, they'll lose that gray and get a little bit whiter until they reach adulthood and they're that typical white that we know. So calving and raising of young. Calving and birthing of young typically happens in coastal estuaries. So for example, the Hudson Bay population, they head out into kind of the Hudson Strait area to large polynyas, areas of open water, or ice-free areas kind of within the Arctic Ocean that maintain that ice-free status through the whole winter. That's where they'll kind of spend time hunting and feeding and doing their breeding. And then when they migrate during the summer months, basically the Hudson Bay loses all of its ice, it all melts. And then the beluga whales know through some miracle, I'd love to find the research that's been done on this. The beluga whales can tell, they basically show up immediately when the river is free of ice and they can go back in there. They go into these large river estuaries, like the Churchill River estuary, for example, is 10 kilometers long and like 2 to 3 kilometers wide. It's quite a large area for them to go. And they spend time kind of in this fresher, warmer water. The waters in the coastal estuaries in the Arctic can be like, you know, almost 10 degrees warmer than the actual Hudson Bay water or in other parts of the Arctic, because all of that fresh water is flowing from inland where it's had the opportunity to warm up. And then gets dumped into the ocean. And so the thought is that, one, the shallow kind of estuary areas, and these are intertidal areas, you know, the water depth could be anywhere from, you know, 5 feet to 30 feet. These areas are often kind of strewn with rocks or at least protected by kind of bars of sand and deposits. The whales are able to go into these estuary systems and find protection from predators. The main predator that we'd be thinking of would be the old killer whale, kind of coming around and trying to take them. But the estuaries kind of provide that protected area, a quiet protected area where they can calve and give birth to their young, typically about 1.5 meters long. Or what does that work out to? About 5 feet long, the calves. And so they're born there, and it's kind of a good scenario, a good protected area. There's lots of whales within these estuary systems, or within the estuaries during the summer months as well. And so it's kind of protection in numbers as well. And something I like to say about beluga whales is it takes a village, so to speak. Or there's something called alloparenting, where you could have a female with a calf, and let's say the female and calf get separated, and then another female may assume the raising of that calf. And this has been documented in captivity, where very, very quickly a female beluga whale has taken on the role of the mother in a mother-calf situation, even though the calf was not hers. So that's pretty interesting, and that's something that definitely happens in the coastal estuaries. And it would be a good question to ask is, when you see a beluga whale with a calf, you know, how many of them are actually that tight bond? I would suggest that it's highly variable. And there was actually a documented case in the St. Lawrence River, close to that endangered population that lives there, where there had been one calf that had been separated from its mother. They don't know what happened to the mother. Maybe the mother was hit by a ship or died from other reasons, or simply got separated due to lots and lots of noise in that river system and was not able to communicate to that calf anymore. So the calf was kind of separated on its own, and over a few days, another female came over, who I believe that she had another calf of her own, came over and ended up bringing that calf in with her and raising that calf. So pretty cool kind of thing, and it definitely takes a village with those beluga whales. So what is the beluga whale eating? And through most of my research, mostly Google image searches, I found that beluga whales definitely have a flavor for small children. This was probably one of my greatest surprises of all of my research. This kid is done for here, that's for sure. That's probably one of the greatest surprises of all my research, is that the main food source for beluga whale is young children. So if there's one thing I know about these whales, it's that they definitely, you definitely don't want to go swimming with them. Just kidding, of course. But yeah, I just found it funny that there's all these different pictures of beluga whales looking like they're going to eat different animals, even though they really wouldn't. And if you ever wondered, this might not be very scientific. If you ever wondered why there's no penguins in the Arctic, quite simply, this picture tells a story. It's because the beluga whales obviously ate all of them. That's the only reason. There's no other science behind it. Here's a picture of a beluga whale trying to eat a hydrophone, or at least sample it. So they obviously, will try different things, and maybe when they run out of food, they'll also try eating each other. But in all seriousness, beluga whales have an incredibly varied diet, everything from crabs to shrimps to clams. An important food source high up, like in kind of the high Arctic, is Greenland halibut, also Arctic cod. Over in Alaska, one of their primary food sources is salmon. And you have lots and lots of invertebrates. In the Churchill River in the summertime, you have capelin coming to spawn in the millions. It's a small little bait fish, maybe kind of similar to herring in many ways. But it'll basically come in, they'll spawn in the estuary system in the millions, and then the beluga whales basically will go on these feeding frenzies, just eating and eating and eating. One of the really neat things with belugas is that, like I say, that diet is highly varied. We're talking over 100 different species that have been documented to be eaten by the beluga. A lot of that has to do with kind of what I talked about, the lack of fuse in their neck and their ability to turn their heads. They also have a lot of control over their face, and you may have seen videos or pictures of beluga whales like blowing bubbles, in aquariums in a perfect circle, or maybe shooting water, creating water jets. These are all different skills that they have because of the varied food sources that they have. They don't really have, the big, strong teeth. Like, I've actually seen the inside of a beluga's mouth with my GoPro, and they're little stubby conical teeth. Pretty typical of a whale, but they're basically very capable of eating all kinds of different stuff. They can, if you can imagine, like a clam buried a little bit on the shore, beluga can use that water jet to blow away the sand and get at it. They can also turn their head quickly to catch a fish or something like that. They're super agile hunters, adaptable hunters, which is really cool. So let's talk about their communication. So I'm sure everyone's heard of echolocation or biosonar. Essentially, what I mentioned before about the melon, it's an important part of their communication system. So that echolocation, the nasal sacs that you can see in the picture, will basically transmit sounds out into the environment. They often sound like really high-pitched clicks or really fast clicks, except 10 times, 100 times faster than that. And it sends out the sound into the environment, and then the sound waves hit whatever's there, whether it be a clam on the bottom of the ocean or Greenland halibut or fish or another beluga whale, and those sounds return back, and the sound is then directed into their lower jaw, where there's a fat-filled cavity, which then ideally would kind of focus the sound or focus those vibrations up into the inner ear, or into the inner ear, where then the whales would be able to process that information and figure out where different things are. Super incredible ability to have, super incredible thing to have. Another interesting piece about this is those nasal sacs in that melon. They help the whale make over 1,200 unique vocalizations, over 1,200. All sorts of different sounds, from screams to whistles to clicks to bubbles to chirping. They get the nickname Canary of the Sea from their large repertoire of calls. They can make all sorts of different sounds. And I had a sound lined up for you, but after testing it when the presentation got going here, I wasn't able to actually get the sound to play through any of my systems. So I highly recommend everybody look up beluga whale vocalizations on YouTube and listen to like a 20-minute soundscape of beluga whale calls. The best way that I can describe it is, like, I have some recordings that I took at like in the Churchill River on trip. All of the Zodiacs have hydrophones, and so I just sat next to it and used my phone to record the sounds we were hearing. And you know, if you can imagine, you know, walking into like a super busy bar on a Friday night, and there's 150 or 200 people in there, and they're all in varying states of well-being, and they're all trying to communicate to each other at the same time. That's kind of what it sounds like when you hear the beluga whales communicating underwater. They're so, the sound is so important in their environment, and communication is so important in their environment. That's probably why they're so highly social and don't really mind switching up, is because they're very capable communicators. They don't mind switching up different pods and moving around because they're very capable communicators with all those different vocalizations. But yeah, I kind of describe them as super extroverted whales. They're just always talking. They're always communicating. They're always making sounds at each other. And there's a researcher that was based at the Vancouver Aquarium, Dr. Valeria Vergara, who has done lots and lots of studies on beluga whale communication, and learned that there's 28 different variations of beluga whale calls that they're fairly certain they know what they are and what they mean. So like contact calls and stress calls and that kind of stuff. Pretty incredible research that's going on there. So that's another one too. You know, if you want to learn more about beluga whale vocalizations, Google Dr. Valeria Vergara, or look up that doctor, and there's a really great, I think it's about a 45-minute lecture that she's got online that kind of describes some of her research. But essentially, learning about these whales and finding that there is kind of there's a common language of some sort between them that they can understand, which is incredible. Oh, the audio is trying to play, but I don't think it is. Okay, so with that being said, I'm just going to kind of quickly describe a year in the life of a beluga whale. Beluga, I'm going to use the Hudson Bay population, which, by the way, is about 57,300 as per the last count. The Western Hudson Bay population, the Eastern Hudson Bay population is much less. And about 2/3 of all beluga whales on Earth reside in Canadian waters or use Canadian waters. I'm Canadian, pat on my back for that one. There's lots that frequent kind of the Beaufort Sea and the East Chukchi Sea. Russia, essentially their range is very much Arctic, but I'll get into that in a little bit. So Western Hudson Bay population of beluga whales, they typically show up in Churchill in kind of mid to late June, and they'll stay in the Churchill River system there all the way through the summer until late fall. So that summer is very short in Churchill. It's like 2.5 months. Spring is pretty short, summer's pretty short, fall's pretty short, and then winter's really long. So the beluga whales, essentially, they'll kind of migrate down once the area is ice free in mid to late June, and then they'll come into the rivers. They'll feed, they'll breed, they'll socialize, etc. And then when the season starts to change to fall again in August, essentially they take on this slide here. They'll take kind of somewhat those routes back towards their winter. Their wintering spot, which, like I was saying before, are those polynyas, or kind of open ice areas that stay open all year round. The winter is the most interesting to me because, you know, not the most interesting to me. I mean, the summer's pretty good, where they live in the winter is really interesting. Like these polynyas in kind of areas of open ice, kind of maybe a small misconception is that just because it's winter time in the Arctic, every single piece of water is frozen and there's nothing moving. Well, that is true in many situations. However, the ocean is such a dynamic system. There's currents and tides and all this kind of stuff that can really make a mess out of the ice and move it around however it needs to. And so a polynya is typically formed by like dominant wind or dominant currents, warmer currents, and tides that kind of create this completely ice-free region that is in the Arctic where animals can come up, like the beluga or the narwhal can come up to breathe without ice being a problem. Which is pretty cool. So that's where the beluga whales will go in the winter time, and they'll spend the winter months hunting for food, fattening, eating, all that kind of stuff, and then they head back again in June to the river estuaries for the calving and the food abundance that's there and the socializing that's there, and then again they leave in August. It's a pretty simple kind of life cycle. It's not as complicated as many others. They just they come and go. So here's a range map that was created by WWF. This is of the North Pole looking down, so of the Arctic from the top of the Earth. So maybe that's why you don't recognize it so quickly. But if you look over on the left side, or my left side, I hope it's your left side, you've got North America, and on the right side you've got Russia and Scandinavia. And anywhere where you can see that there is kind of that shaded color with the diagonal lines through it, that is the main summer distribution. This map is really important, and you'll see it again in just a little bit. But anywhere where there's kind of just the plain yellow, that's their entire range. So like I was saying, the beluga whales in the Hudson Bay, they all vacate the Hudson Bay. They head out to Hudson Strait or in between Baffin Island and Greenland there and spend time away from shore. And all of the populations around the world have a similar migration migration system for that. So global population is between, I've seen so many varying estimates, between 135,000 and 200,000, let's say. The IUCN is calling the general population of least concern. However, there are certain populations like the St. Lawrence River, the Cook Inlet, and the Ungava Bay populations that would be considered endangered or critically endangered, or in the case of Ungava Bay, potentially extirpated. Here's another look at kind of the beluga whale range. Circumpolar. So let's just talk a little bit about different populations. These ones are quite interesting to me, kind of from a conservation standpoint, because they are the most threatened of the populations. So I had to make this map because every single map that I looked for, or every single kind of every single kind of range map that I looked for, never included what's just outside of that square. So the picture on the right there, which has kind of all the little black dots, are where like 50% of the population usually frequents. And then you've kind of got their general range or critical habitat, which is highlighted in, I think that's a green, colorblind, sorry. But this map, you notice that just down to the left, it almost, in my opinion, purposefully cuts off what's just outside the map, which is Quebec City and Montreal further up the St. Lawrence Seaway. So this, I find that's a really important thing to discuss. This is like one of the main, it is the main kind of shipping route from Eastern Canada. You're thinking like, all the shipping, like all sea traffic that has kind of come from Toronto, Montreal, Quebec City, these big Canadian cities. It all kind of ends up going out the St. Lawrence. It's also that same area, which is critical habitat for those beluga whales, is also kind of the same place that all the water kind of drains out of from all those cities. And so what was discovered here is that these beluga whales probably have some of the highest contaminant loads of any of the beluga whale populations. It's extremely high. You know, mercury, PCBs, that kind of stuff. Basically, persistent organic pollutants, POPs. These things that kind of end up in the food chain and then work their way up. Oh, and microplastics. Let's not forget microplastics. That's a really big one. These things that end up kind of working their way up the food chain to the beluga whale are in really, really high volume and density and concentration in the St. Lawrence Seaway. And so this beluga whale deals with that. On top of that, the map on the right-hand side there, you can see all those shipping lanes. They're kind of the yellowish red green lines. That's where you have these large tanker and container ships that are running through the St. Lawrence Seaway to head out to market. And we are talking thousands of vessels every year going directly through the critical habitat of beluga whales. There's even, you know, you see where it says Tadoussac on that map there. There's even, like that's the Saguenay River estuary. It's critical habitat for beluga whale all through there, but there's even some discussion of trying to run a pipeline, an oil and gas pipeline directly to that region, and then having container ships leave directly from there filled with oil and gas. That obviously met a huge opposition, and there's a big national park there as well. But it didn't make sense to plunk down such large industry right in the middle of critical habitat for an endangered population of beluga whales. Now, you may wonder why this population is not connected to the northern populations. And a lot of that has to do kind of with the last 14,000 years of history since the last ice age. This is what we would call kind of like a relic or remnant population that has essentially hung on in this area because the conditions resemble the Arctic well enough, with kind of a cold water flow coming out of the Saguenay River and a good river estuary system and lots of food. It has been able to support life there, support the beluga whales for quite some time. Now, within recorded history, the original population of beluga whales in that area was over 10,000. So that is what's considered to be kind of the carrying capacity of that environment, is about 10,000. Today, there's only 900, and they're losing about 1% of their population each year due to the threats that I discussed before. Yeah, so that's the St. Lawrence River population. There is a lot of work being done to try to address the decline of this population, and one of the goals for this population is to increase the population to nearly 8,000 whales. At what point we're going to get there, I don't know, because it does take some time for a population like this to rebound in that way. It will take some time. So now let's go up to Alaska. Now we've got Cook Inlet. Cook Inlet, Alaska, the population there, the median number, they're not sure. They did aerial counting. It was about 279 whales. Now there's another place that is kind of filled with ship traffic and industry, and likely has a large contaminant load as well. Cook Inlet, heading over towards Anchorage, Alaska, you've got that big port there, but also scattered throughout the beluga whales range are oil platforms and all of the shipping that goes with that. So another situation where you've got kind of whales that are a population that is in decline and has been for quite some time, but kind of the industry is taking precedence over their long-term conservation at the moment. Yeah, and something that's important to note is, yeah, at the end of Cook Inlet is Anchorage, Alaska, one of the larger cities in Alaska. And then the Ungava Bay population. So on the right-hand side, it says Ungava Bay 32 endangered by Cossowik, which is a Canadian endangered species list. So Ungava Bay, essentially, this is a lesson to be learned. There were large-scale commercial factories that were in Ungava Bay quite some time ago. Actually, not that long ago, like within many people's lifetimes, there was commercial hunting of beluga whales in Ungava Bay. However, because beluga whales, like they come back to the river estuaries and they come back to the same area year after year for the calving and feeding and whatnot, they have really high site return rates, and it doesn't necessarily deter them from coming back to that same place, even if a bunch of them were hunted, because it's necessary within their annual cycle, and it's the only place they really know to go. So what ended up happening in Ungava Bay was essentially there was lots of commercial hunting that got to the point where it took every whale. It took pretty much every whale that was there, and by the time it was stopped, it was too late. And it's thought that population. Now I have to really emphasize something here. This is not traditional sustenance hunting. This is not traditional food hunting. This is commercial hunting to take the beluga whales and process them and ship them to the rest of North America and overseas for various projects. That it was a really big industry, like all the way through the early 1900s to mid 1900s into the 60s to do that kind of stuff. And it happened in Churchill as well, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a bit. But not of whales getting slaughtered, just of the whale factory. But that happened in Ungava Bay, and by the time it all got stopped, it was uncertain as to whether any of the whales that had made kind of Ungava Bay or had historically used Ungava Bay for their calving and estuary use had happened. And there's some speculation that says that, well, maybe the whales that they do see, like those 32 whales, they might not even belong to that population group. They may just be stragglers from the eastern Hudson Bay population, which is just a few thousand kilometers around the corner. But yeah, so that's an example of, well, it wasn't checked, it wasn't watched, and it got way out of hand, unfortunately. But there may be hope. Maybe there is actually 32 Ungava Bay whales that are fighting to reproduce and come back. But there's a very good chance that population was locally extirpated. Yeah, great. So let's talk about their natural predators. You can see on the right-hand side there, we've got a polar bear with a beluga carcass, and on the left, this is not an Arctic photo. Obviously, there's trees, but killer whales are another natural predator. So what the polar bears may do, there's been quite a few different kind of documented attempts at polar bears hunting beluga whales, and it does happen on occasion. They may scavenge from a dead animal that either died of old age or weakness. It was easy to catch, but oftentimes, or what may happen, like in the Arctic, is beluga whales, they try to time their movements with the ice, but if there's a sudden wind shift or something changes and the ice situation changes around them, there's a possibility that they could get trapped within a large ice flow in a very small area of water. And if they do get trapped in there, basically all that they have the ability to do, there's likely a pod or a few of them that this is happening in. It might just be like a little circle of ice where there's a dozen or so whales that are just constantly swimming back and forth. And they have to come up to breathe, but they also have to keep coming up so that hole doesn't freeze shut. Now, if a polar bear was to stumble across this commotion, there's a good chance that that polar bear might try to grab onto one of those whales and hunt it for itself from that hole. The beluga whales, they may just end up getting trapped there, and they may actually succumb to exhaustion before they're able to escape that ice system. And that is one of the risks of being a beluga whale and living kind of in the harsh Arctic the harsh and constantly changing ice environment. Now, orcas are also natural predators. However, they only really make a presence in the Arctic in the summer months. And so again, you know, going back to those river estuary systems is probably a good diversion for those large or the faster and more carnivorous orca that may come in and try to take out a beluga whale or two. Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit more about natural predators in a bit too. So let's talk about kind of some of the uses when it comes to the historical uses of beluga whale. Beluga whale for millennia have been a traditional sustenance food for people of the Arctic. You may have heard the term muktuk. Muktuk comes from beluga whale, where they harvest a beluga whale and then take that really rich fatty blubber and eat it, and it is super rich in calories and nutrients, and an incredible source of energy for northern people. And so there was widespread traditional use. There still is widespread traditional use across the Arctic. It is such an important food source to each of the groups that rely on it, that many, you know, quite a number of beluga whales are hunted each year for that purpose. Is it anything like the numbers that used to be taken? No, it is strictly on a community basis, and there are limits put in place for the number of whales that they should take based on current population estimates in certain areas. For example, like in Ungava Bay, if there's 32 whales that are there, there won't be any harvesting of beluga whales there for that exact reason. But still an incredibly important food source. And one of the kind of the tragic things that has been occurred is there's actually now a warning on beluga whale meat, like for people in those communities. In particular, if you're pregnant, there's kind of the idea that you shouldn't eat beluga whale meat because of the toxins that the whales carry in their fat. They can vary because they are fatty animals. They store some of these pollutants in their fat tissue, and so by being a top of the food chain animal, I think I've got the picture. Oh, I had a picture. Basically, because they are top of the food chain animal, actually it's coming up later in the presentation. All those toxins like mercury and POPs and different toxins kind of build their way up, and then they get stored in this animal. And then if humans are eating the beluga whale, then we're getting an entire lifetime of toxin load when we eat that fat. And so there's definitely warnings to those communities about how much they should be eating, or how much they could eat, just the same way that we're not supposed to have more than 3 servings of fish a week because of the mercury content. You can imagine it'd be much higher the higher up the food chain you go. Human use, industrial and commercial. I definitely separate this out from sustenance or from traditional sustenance hunting. In Churchill, Manitoba, where we today do beluga whale viewings, back in the 1950s and 60s, there's the Churchill Whale Products factory there, where they would hunt anywhere between 400 and 700 beluga whales in that area annually, and process the fats and the meats and the skin for a variety of different products, and then ship it around North America and abroad. That same type of program happened widespread throughout the Arctic, where it was possible. Whaling was such a huge business in the 50s and 60s until it was mostly or internationally agreed upon that we would stop hunting whales and marine mammals in the late 60s and early 70s. Now, something I always like to come back to is, in particular with Churchill, and it's also just something I think about with conservation in general, is, you know, here's a place like Churchill, here's a place where they had a commercial whaling factory there in the 1960s. They harvested all these whales, and this is in Canada, and then that was banned, and so now there's a new industry, which is, okay, well, we have these beluga whales, let's bring people in to see them. And now there's this really booming and bustling and considerate and caring whale viewing program that goes on, which is really great. Really wonderful people in the community doing that. But also Canada has completely banned any new beluga whales or any new marine mammals in captivity. So what I like about that is this whale factory was still around, like in many of our lifetimes. And within our lifetime, we've gone from a point of hunting whales or hunting an animal for our commercial use to a point where we won't even have them in captivity anymore, because we don't agree that it's basically an unethical behavior to have the beluga whales in captivity like that, especially a wide-ranging species like this. And it's a really wonderful kind of U-turn that we've made, or an about face. And whenever I'm feeling down or maybe a little bit disappointed with the way certain conservation initiatives are going on a global scale, national or international scale, I kind of remember that we were able to do that within one person's lifetime. So just because something that I see today is not changing doesn't mean that it won't. Just got to keep working for it. Anyway, that's that. Live captures for aquariums. So on that note, that right next to that whale, factory, a few years later, the big industry for beluga whales was actually live captures. So many of the whales beluga whales that are in North America today are descendants from whales that were caught in Churchill. They're called like beluga cowboys. They basically go out in boats and round up a young whale, get it into the shallows, and then somebody would jump out of the boat onto the whale and kind of wrestle it and then calm it and get it into kind of a net of some sort, and then lift it up into a large pool, and then it would be transported to a specialized, I think it was a 737, a specialized 737 for transporting the whale, and then the whale would be delivered to its next destination, which would be an aquarium somewhere in North America. There was over 60 live captures in Churchill. The beluga whales that were in Vancouver were I think directly caught in Churchill in the 70s or 80s. And then most whales today that are in North America are descendants from the whales that were caught up in Churchill as well. Today, that is not happening in Canada or the United States. There's no more live captures for aquariums. There is a small number of whales being taken in other parts of the world for use in the global aquarium market. Yeah, so a lot of this is kind of pointed towards this conservation discussion with beluga whales. That is, yes, they are a relatively abundant species. You know, there's 135,000 to 200,000 of them on Earth, depending on which population count you address. And right now they're okay. Like we discussed, there are several populations that are threatened, but their future, especially in a place like the Arctic is a hot topic in particular when it comes to discussing climate change. Their future is definitely going to be an interesting one to watch, and an important one to kind of to get ahead of and protect them and protect things for them before things get too carried away in the Arctic. So like I was saying, we've got bioaccumulation. A big one, everything kind of ties in with climate change with an Arctic species like this. Because I'll just skip ahead. Yeah, I'll skip ahead to this slide here. So, you know, everything kind of comes down to that. This basically says mean surface temperature anomaly for September 1st, 2014 to 17. So essentially, this map is showing you kind of the darkest red colors is greater than 8 degrees above the normal, or what is the average temperature from that date between 1961 and 1990. And you know, maybe this isn't the best map for this, but essentially the Arctic is warming. The Arctic is with less ice in the summer. You have all of that sunshine that is no longer being reflected away by the ice, and the water, the dark water surface is absorbing the temperature, and the Arctic is warming at a rate faster than anywhere else on the planet as well because of this ice loss. And so what that means is with less ice, you have more activity, more human activity. Many of you maybe have heard that there's, not too long ago was the first cruise ship that went through the Northwest Passage. This is a passage that had been locked up for many years, and there's dozens of explorer expeditions that went and tried to find the Northwest Passage, a gateway to the east. But essentially now it's becoming more and more open each year, and there's more and more access for humans each year. This doesn't just mean shipping traffic. This means, yes, shipping traffic. It also means a longer period of time when recreational boats are able to move around from different communities. It means that the Arctic environment is less hostile. It also means you're able to get shipping, or you're able to get like barges and whatnot in there to haul out raw material from large-scale mines that are being planned for that area. It also means that maybe one day, or in the not so distant future, we're going to see kind of oil drilling and oil and gas exploration happening up in this area. It's essentially just becoming more and more open for trade and for expansion every year that it gets warmer, which it depends on how you look at it. It's probably great if you are trying to get maybe a nickel ore out of somewhere that you used to only have 2 months of shipping time, but now you have 4 months of shipping time, so you're able to ramp up production. That would be great. But if you're a beluga whale that basically lives and thrives in relatively quiet and mostly inaccessible waters up in, you're not going to be super happy to have more and more ships and more noise and more contaminants and that kind of stuff entering the ocean system. So with increased activity, human activity, you're going to have this bioaccumulation. It's either going to be kind of a mercury, sorry, I'm on a sailboat right now and it just really shuddered. Some interesting stuff going on with the weather here. Anyway, back to it. So with mercury and other contaminants and toxins, they're going to bioaccumulate up, starting right down, with invertebrates, and then to fish, and then to beluga whales, or to seals, and then eventually to polar bears and humans and birds and all that kind of stuff. And that toxin accumulation is going to be quite significant and increasing each year because of expansion into the Arctic, which is not great. On top of that, you're going to have less predictable ice flows and kind of changing environments that maybe beluga whales haven't dealt with before. Yes, they're well adapted to life in the Arctic, but their systems often rely on this freeze-thaw cycle. And if you've got kind of a big freeze coming in, but it's not happening for a few weeks later, or it happens and then thaws again, or perhaps it thaws in the springtime, but then there's like a cold blast that wasn't expected and it freezes again, then many whales could get confused, trapped. With less sea ice as well, there's going to be like less summer sea ice and winter sea ice. There's basically less ability for algae to grow on the bottom and then feed the food chain. So entire food chains and areas which may have been once abundant for the beluga whale will entirely change as well. And so they'll have to adapt in a really rapid fashion to these changing times. This one is really important. You saw this map on the right before. You can see kind of the dark shaded area is the main summer distribution. That's the most important, is the main summer distribution. Now, look at this map on the right, where whales most likely occur during the summer months, and then overlay that with the planned or suggested shipping routes and frequency kind of once the polar ice cap has pretty well melted in the summer months, which is not too far off. I think this map was like 2040 is kind of what they were thinking may happen. But if you look in particular, you know, close to Baffin Island or the Beaufort Sea, or also on the kind of the northern slope of Russia there, the number of ships that are going to start kind of intruding into beluga whale summer habitat is going to have a huge effect on their well-being. The sound of these ships can travel for many, many kilometers underwater, and it will interrupt their communication with each other. You also have the possibility of ship strikes, and those are two major threats. You also have the increased possibility of oil or chemical spills happening in the Arctic, and there's not really a significant kind of stride in that type of cleanup to say, you know, yes, we'll be able to protect these beluga whales. There's a new research facility that was recently built in the Churchill River, and that one is going to study a lot to do with kind of oil and sea ice interaction and how it's going to work, and how it may, like with increased shipping in the Arctic, which is inevitable at this point, and how that's going to affect different marine species like beluga whales, polar bears, seals, bowhead whales, narwhals, all these animals that have not really had exposure to that type of thing so far in human kind of development and overall takeover of the earth. So that's my presentation. In conclusion, everybody, you know, I want to say that this whale is super incredible to see in the wild. They are beautiful, curious, sociable animals that at the moment are relatively safe, or very safe, and have very strong populations in Canada. And it is a heck of a lot of fun to sit in a Zodiac and listen to their easy extroverted conversation between each other, but also to kind of watch their behaviors with each other and just be around them in their environment in those summer months. So if you ever were wondering, yeah, you know, I'd like to see a beluga whale in the wild, you know, Nat Hab's a really great choice. You get up there and you have some fantastic experiences. And I've got I don't know, there's something like, you know, going kayaking or stand-up paddleboarding with them is something out of this world as well. Just, you don't need, like, whale watching with, or whale viewing with beluga whales, you really don't have to do very much work, because they're watching you more than you're watching them in a lot of instances, if that makes any sense. So anyway, thank you very much. And if you want to see some pictures and stuff that I post on social media, check me out on Instagram at Eddy Savage BC, and on Facebook.com/Eddy Savage BC. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Eddie. That was wonderful. We have some good questions for you, and I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question for Eddie, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, first question. What is the normal purpose of a whale's dorsal fin, and does the lack of one affect the beluga swimming?
Right. With the beluga, I assume it would just make them more maneuverable. They're not particularly fast-moving animals, and a dorsal fin could be something that would help them kind of stay in motion, or have a little bit more stability while maneuvering underwater. I actually haven't ever read something that told me the exact purpose of a dorsal fin, so I'm kind of speculating a little bit on that one. But with belugas, they're so maneuverable. I can imagine if they had a big, tall dorsal fin, it would just make them less maneuverable.
Mm-hmm. So someone watching said they noticed the scars that you often see on belugas with the photos in the wild. Are they typically from boats or fighting, or what are they from?
That's a great question, and I'm happy to tell you that it's not really either of those. There may be some scars that come from fighting or raking, like they'll kind of rake their teeth on each other occasionally, but really what it's likely from is when the beluga whales head into the river estuaries in the summertime, they're also kind of sloughing off layers of skin. So it might just be from them kind of rubbing into a rock or some kind of feature on the bottom of the estuary to help move that skin off. There also may be some scars from other interactions. They may have swam too hard into some ice, or they may have gotten into an altercation. But definitely a lot of my pictures, like if you notice those scrapes, this is in the summer months when they're losing that layer of skin. And so it's going to be from that, most likely from that.
Okay, great. And I'm going to combine a couple questions here. What is the lifespan of a beluga in the wild? And is it possible for belugas to give birth to more than one baby?
Okay, two questions. All right, so the lifespan is actually, it's quite interesting. So the way that you tell the life of a beluga whale is if you take one of their teeth. It's similar to polar bears as well, and actually many mammals, but you take a layer of their teeth and you bisect it, cut it down the middle, take a look at it, and you'll be able to count basically the growth rings on the teeth. And for a long time, they thought that that 2 growth rings meant 1 year. Excuse me. And so they were counting them, and they thought that the lifespan, researchers thought that the lifespan of the whales was around 40 years at the top end. However, more recently, they've kind of relooked at that, and it's now theorized that each ring equals 1 year, and so the lifespan of a beluga whale can be up to 80 years or so, or at least it's still kind of a mystery. You can probably imagine that over the years, like in particular when they were doing kind of commercial hunting, there weren't a lot of people looking at questions like that, and so now information that we get, it's already, maybe a lot of those older whales are already out of the population, or the really long-lived ones are out of the population. But the ones that do get hunt for traditional purposes, getting a hold of a tooth for something like that may be a little bit tricky. But I know there's people out there that are doing it.
And,
oh yes, and as far as twins or more than one calf, I'm sure it could happen theoretically. Have I heard of it? No, but I'm sure it has happened at some point in the history of the beluga whale, but typically it's one calf, 1.5 meter or 5 foot long baby. If you can imagine being only 14 feet long and having a baby that is 1/3 of your size, just that's more than enough, I think.
That's incredible, yeah.
Yeah.
And sort of on that subject, someone was wondering if they did the beluga strip with Nat Hab up in Churchill, if they'd see baby belugas.
There's a super high possibility. I think, if you see one, depends on the sociability of the beluga whales on the trip, but there's a very good chance that you'll see one kind of surfacing. Females with the beluga calves are a little less sociable. They've got a lot. I'm sure they have a lot on their plate, and so typically, if you're going to see one, you'll see one at, I'm not saying like 500 meters, but it just won't be as close as the other ones, unless you're really lucky and you get one that's just super curious and mom's kind of encouraging it to be curious. But yes, you can see them on the trip.
Great. Is it likely that predation by orcas will increase as the polar region becomes warmer?
Absolutely. So that's already happening. That's a good question. So essentially, the more time that you have ice free in the Arctic, the more likely it will be for orcas to kind of move in and around. 2014, we had orca come in to the Churchill River estuary. Right out in front of Churchill, there was a pod of orcas looking for seals or for beluga whales, and that is just that frequency, whether or not they actually show up in the Churchill River estuary or where they show up in the Arctic, it's hard to say, but there definitely will be more predation by orcas with less sea ice, because the orcas steer clear of the sea ice. They don't have the same kind of adaptations that the beluga has to living in those environments. And so if there's too much, the orcas will just turn around and get out of there. But if it's open for 4 or 5 months, yeah, absolutely, killer whales will move right in and start preying on belugas more frequently.
Mm-hmm. So a couple trip-related questions here I'm going to combine. One, is there a trip in Churchill where you can see both belugas and polar bears? It's a common question we get. And so someone here is saying they've been to Churchill to see polar bears. If they went on the belugas trip, how much duplication is there on the itinerary?
Oh gosh, every time. Well, there's like some duplication. I'll start with the duplication question, then go to the beluga and polar bear question. So the polar bear trips, they're very focused on polar bears. So if you've been for a polar bear trip, chances are you haven't experienced Churchill in the way you would in the summertime. So the summer months are when Churchill's at its most accessible, and you can get out and basically not only are there beluga whales, that is like just one of the many things that you could see. The summer months, you're talking about Arctic wildlife. You've got the chance to see caribou. You've got the chance to see Arctic fox or red fox as some of the mammals. You really never know. You also have the chance to see polar bears, and I'll touch on that again. As well, there's migratory birds. So there's around 300 different species of birds that come through the Churchill region. And in the summertime, most of my trips were easily seeing, between 40 and 50 different types of birds. We're talking like maybe snow geese, maybe a snowy owl, but not as likely. But like tundra swans and loons and all sorts of different shorebirds and songbirds. It's actually and different raptors as well. Like I've seen a peregrine falcon in Churchill, bald eagles, red-tailed hawk, northern harrier. Like there's just a variety of different birds that can make it through. Whether or not you see them is dependent on each trip, and because wildlife is wildlife. But there'll be like such a minimal duplication of what you did on a polar bear trip. Like maybe you'll go to the Sanitac Museum again, or you might go to the Parks Canada Visitor Center again, but it is completely different in the summertime. And you don't have to wear a parka, which is also something. It's pretty cool. Okay, and then as far as seeing polar bears and beluga whales, so that's like, it's probably one of the most often questions I get, one of the most popular questions is like, because people want to see it all, right? You want to see the polar bears, you want to see the belugas, you want to see northern lights, all these draws that Churchill has. And there is a possibility in the summer months, like I would say beluga whales, it's like if you don't see a beluga whale in Churchill in July and August when you're there, like on a Nat Hab trip, there's something seriously wrong, because there's like 3,000 to 4,000 beluga whales in the Churchill River estuary. 3,000 to 4,000 beluga whales. So you're probably going to see one. I think, fingers crossed there. But with the polar bears, so polar bears, they have a different cycle to their year. Like their most active season is kind of the winter time when they're out and they're hunting seals. And as the sea ice melts, it can actually kind of persist out in the Hudson Bay, June into July. These bears that have basically just spent the whole winter and spring hunting food are now like at their biggest and healthiest. They're basically covered in fat. They've gained a ton of weight, and they're getting kicked off the ice because the ice is melting, and it's just too much energy to try to move over the melting ice trying to catch seals. So they come back into shore, and they basically find really cool spots. Some of them might be like way out, on like a spit of like a rocky spit that goes out like 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers, where there's a constant sea breeze and they can easily slink into the water and cool off. Or they may go inland and try to kind of hide out in the boreal forest in a nice cool space there next to some water. But particularly, most of them will spend their time really close to the Hudson Bay, really close to the water, and they're not as active or as inquisitive as they would be in the fall when the temperatures are cooler. Like if you can imagine having just had like 300 Thanksgiving dinners, you know, gained 250 pounds, and you were like out on the ice on the water, and the hottest that it got was like 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you decided to come into shore where it's like 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you threw on, you know, a couple of parkas, the polar bear's fur, and basically, and then somebody asked you to go move around. It's like, you ain't moving, you know, you're going to do whatever you can to stay cool. And so that's essentially what the polar bears are doing. They're very well insulated. Yes, they have a summer fur coat, but it's still a fur coat, and they want to stay close to the water, and they're not moving very much. So you could have a bear that like sleeps on the same rock for 3 or 4 days. And, you know, if you want to have like you know, a really high profile polar bear experience, the chances of you having one in the summer are not as great as if you had one in the fall when it's cooler and the bears are moving around. So yes, there's bears around in the fall, or in the summer, but they're not as active, and they're often further away and harder to spot, but they can be there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to call it there with questions. Thank you so much, Eddy, for presenting for us. I know you're taking some time away from the webinars, so we'll miss you, but we'll have you back as soon as we can. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Right on. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to come and present on animals and places that I'm passionate about for Nat Hab, and I'm really looking forward to getting back out in the field and taking hopefully some of you folks watching on an expedition here or there. All right. Enjoy your day. Take care. Thank you.
All right. Thanks again, Eddy. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us on Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out our website at nathab.com/webinars for next week's lineup. And of course, you can keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news announcement. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a good weekend.